Hi, my name's Lynn and I'm studying to become a B.C.B.A. In today's episode, we're going to jump into the next class for the entirety of the series, which is BEH 5041. It's also titled, at least for my course, it was titled the Measurement and Experimental Design for Behavior Change. So it covers a lot. There's a huge range of topics that it touches on, so I'm just going to go over kind of the basics per unit because each unit was very lengthy. This particular unit was just very technically heavy because it just has so many smaller topics within each topic. So there's the main idea and then the topics and then subtopics and then the definitions per term. So there's a lot to break down. So let's get started, shall we? So BEH 5041 starts Unit 1 with Intro to Assessment. Now, there are multiple types of assessments, but realistically, we have to consider what is the whole purpose of what we're doing? What are we trying to accomplish here? And we have to remember that behavior analysis is systematically gathering information to make database decisions regarding behavior and the environment. We have to think about what we have to change and what we can do, right? So there are three general methods of assessment in order to start this process. The first is preliminary indirect assessments, which are things like interviews, record reviews, things that are not directly including the client, but maybe the stakeholders. So when we interview stakeholders, like parents or grandparents or teachers, we're interviewing them, right? So we're getting kind of a basic breadth of information about the client without actually meeting the client. Even if the client is present, it's still considered indirect because we're interviewing the parent. The second method is a descriptive assessment, also known as a direct naturalistic observation, and that is where you actually observe the client in the environment and see what happens. You're not doing anything, you're just watching what happens, taking note of any observations that you see. The third type of assessment is a functional analysis. Now, this one includes systematic manipulation of anything that you get from the preliminary, indirect, and the direct assessments. So it kind of goes in that order as well, the preliminary, indirect assessment, and then the descriptive assessment, and then the functional analysis, because you kind of want to pinpoint what you have to look for. And the way you do that is you narrow it down from indirect to direct to functional analysis. The reason why we do this is because we have to consider the ecological perspective of behavior. So what is extrinsically motivating, or what is the extrinsic variable of the behavior? So what can we change in the environment that can influence the behavior, right? Because of this, assessments are ongoing. Just because we have a preliminary interview and a descriptive observation and a functional analysis that includes systematic manipulations of the environment, we are constantly trying to assess to see how our interventions are changing the behavior, if they are, right? And so one thing that the unit points out is a lot of the criticisms of ABA actually stem from really poor assessment procedure or method. So unfortunately, because it is an ongoing process, methods change. We get updated information all the time. This is somewhat of a young scientific field. So we do still look into better methods of how to do these assessments. Now, when I say how to do it, it's that there are multiple ways you can do it. So for instance, even with an interview, you can do open-ended interview, you can do a Likert scale on rating 1 to 5 or whatever. You can do kind of different ways of doing it, but how much information are you gathering from that and how utilizable is that information that you get it from? So again, a lot of criticisms that come into you guys are only focused on bad behaviors or you guys are trying to make robots or anything. It's really just a combination of poor assessment along with probably wrong intervention. That goes into a much deeper topic that they talk about later, but this is just the introduction of this is where some criticisms come from. So from there, they go into the different qualities of assessment. So assessment scope is the range of information that's gathered within whatever method you use. So think of the degree of focus on the issue that you're getting from an interview or an observation or even just a functional analysis. The second is assessment fidelity. Now, fidelity is the accuracy of the information that you've gathered. So let's say mom thinks that the screaming is caused from access to toys, but then when you do the direct observation, it looks more like, oh, the bad behavior, so to speak, is actually motivated by attention instead, right? So we want to make sure that the accuracy of the information that we have is high. From there, it moves on to measure validity, and this is covering the extent that the info directly related to the behavior is accurate. So like how much of the information that you're gathering is relevant to the behavior of interest. So you want to make sure that you're validly collecting data. Just because you're taking a lot of notes from an interview doesn't mean all that's going to be really relevant to you. And then the last item that they cover is measure reliability, and that's to the extent that a measure yields the same every time. So if 5 people are watching a client perform a behavior, how many of them are going to say, oh, it took 5 seconds for this person to do this? So it kind of touches base with the IOA or inter-observer agreement, but that's not to be confused with accuracy. And accuracy is the closeness of a measured value compared to known standard values. So we know an inch is an inch, we know 5 seconds is 5 seconds. So measure reliability is how consistently can you measure it accurately, and then accuracy itself is, are you measuring the correct unit or correct standard correctly? From there, the unit moves on to Hawkins' 5 phases of assessment, and it's in the shape of a funnel. I don't particularly like the visual that they use for a funnel, so I don't know if I'm going to include it, because to me, I just felt like it was more confusing. But basically it talks about the 5 phases. So the first phase, of course, is screening and general information, general disposition, and that's your preliminary assessment. And then it goes into definition of the problem or achievement, and that's where you go for the indirect or direct descriptive analysis. The third phase is pinpointing and designing intervention. So you're pinpointing what you want to change and you are designing the intervention for it. So that would be your functional analysis. That would be your baseline assessment where you take data. And then from there, phase 4 is monitoring progress. So you implement the intervention, you monitor the progress, you see how that works. And then the 5th phase is a follow-up assessment. Remember, assessments are always ongoing, so that last phase is another assessment of what you just did. The funnel that I refer to with this Hawkins is comparing scope and fidelity per step. And if you just think of it rationally, it will make more sense. So I remember in this unit quiz, it asks, does this thing have high fidelity or low scope or whatever? Because it's fidelity and scope. So if you think about it, for instance, in phase 1, the screening process is broad scope because you're getting a large amount of data, and low fidelity, which is to say it's not exactly going to be the most accurate compared to what you need to pay attention to, right? So remember, scope is the range and the degree of focus, and fidelity is making sure you have accurate data gathered of that particular thing. So for instance, in phase 3, when it says pinpoint and design intervention, that is a very narrow scope because you're looking at a very specific set of data and set of information, and it's very high fidelity because you have very specific notes on that thing, on that behavior. So that's where they talk about high or low scope and fidelity and broad scope and fidelity. Now from there, they talk about the types of behavior issues that you'll have to fix, so to speak. So this would be in the form of behavioral excess. So let's say a kid likes to clap, which is totally fine. It's an appropriate behavior after a show, after a song, after whatever. But let's say they like to clap while they're standing in line waiting for something, or they're clapping while they're trying to express anger or something like that. It's just a bit excessive. So you can't really tell if there's any sort of function for it beyond just them clapping. So that could be considered uncomfortable. Now, clapping is fairly innocuous. It's not going to hurt anyone, but something as simple as using the restroom, there have been cases where a person will try to use the restroom 50 times a day. Behavioral excess, yes. And is that going to cause a behavioral issue? Yeah, because it's going to interrupt their daily life. The other type of problem with behavior would be a performance issue. So let's say that they can brush their teeth pretty well, but they always forget to put enough toothpaste on the toothbrush. So they're still developing cavities. So they can do most of the steps, they just don't have very high accuracy or high mastery of that. So it's a performance issue, right? So they can do it, it's just their level of ability towards it. Another topic of behavior is deficit. So let's say they can't unscrew the lid to the toothpaste tube, so they never put toothpaste on there. Is that necessarily a performance issue? Not necessarily, because if they can't physically do it, that doesn't mean they don't want to and that they're not trying. It just means it's a physical barrier for them. So I mean, that would be considered a deficit. And then the last one would be generalization. So where behavioral excess is a lack of stimulus control so that they're clapping everywhere, right? Generalization would be that they only clapped after someone saying happy birthday, and they never clapped after a show or after someone said congratulations or anything like that. They only had one moment or one stimulus control that's too high, right? So it's possible to have too high stimulus control and too low stimulus control. If you have it too high, then your behavior is going to have a hard time generalizing, right? And if it's too low, that means the behavior happens too much everywhere else, right? There's just a lack of stimulus control. So those are the 4 kinds of behavior issues that you will basically be addressing during this time, and that's what the assessments are for, is to determine what type of behavior issue you're dealing with. Now, from there, they discuss the preliminary assessment steps. So because it's intro to assessment, they just kind of start going into the nitty-gritty. I broke this down quite a bit, but there's still more per step. So it's not just follow these steps. They go in depth into each and every step. There was like a video per step. It was pretty excessive in my opinion. Anyways, it moves on to preliminary assessment steps, which is number 1, determine who consents, right? So who is the consenting party within this whole ordeal? Number 2 is you get permission and you get the resources to follow up on behavioral services. So this is kind of determining, after figuring out who consents, where you can start putting your interviews, right? Like, okay, so mom consents. Should I interview? Can I interview her type of deal? From there, step 3 is complete your initial intake. So that is kind of like you're deciding whether or not you should provide services. After that interview, if it's like, my kid is 3 and he cries when he doesn't get a toy, what do I do? It's not really requiring of services unless they're like, he cries for 6 hours every time. Okay, that's a behavioral excess. But if it's like he cries for 15 minutes, I mean, 3-year-olds are going to do that, right? So, I mean, you have to have a healthy expectation of age range as well, which they do cover in this. Step 4 is initial review of records and data. So usually there's previous records and previous data on clients. If the client is brand new to ABA and you're the first contact, then you're not going to have much, but you will have some information about why they were suggested to you in the first place, right? Why there was any referral in the first place. Chances are they went to a pediatrician or a doctor of sorts and they're like, yeah, we'll refer you to a specialist. From there, number 5, you meet the client for an initial observation, and that's when you do your naturalistic or descriptive assessments. And then from there, step 6 is a document disposition. So it's a preliminary assessment results. So you overlook or overview your results. So those are the steps. I remember in the unit test, they ask you to put some in order, like they'll say like, they did this and this, what's their next step? So you have to remember specifically what actions lead to each one. So that's why there's like video in depth on like the actions of each. With that, they moved on to indirect assessment methods. So again, it's like interviews, structured forms. So you don't always need to interview someone. You can give them a form to fill out. You can give them Likert scales. You can give them different open-ended questions or structured forms, again, like I mentioned. And then you want to make sure that you're always trying to go over the current archival records. So there should be a reason why they were referred to you. So you want to look over those things and you want to make sure that you have a good grasp before you put forth the interview or any sort of preliminary assessment. They kind of go hand in hand. With that, it goes to direct or descriptive assessment. So this is where they're in a natural setting with no manipulations. That's a very important point. They will ask about that on the unit test. I remember that much. And then from there, they also have a different method for descriptive assessment called narrative or recording ABC data. So ABC, A is antecedent, B is behavior, C is consequence. So you just take notes of what happened before, what the behavior was, and what happened after. So you have a very descriptive amount of data to hypothesize the functional relations. There's also something called scatter plots, which I thought was pretty interesting. And it's basically you check when the actual behavior occurs. So it's correlational, not causal, but it gives you a general idea of what time of day you should be doing interventions or observations, right? So if the kid only exhibits these behaviors in the morning, you're probably not going to want to put interventions in the afternoon. So scatter plots will help you narrow that down. Sometimes you'll need to get the parents or the caretakers help with that as well, to just so that you have it marked down, especially if it happens in a school. I've actually seen that where they took notes on when it happened at school, and it always happened after lunch. So then they figured out, okay, well, after lunch we're gonna do this, and so that's how it's gonna be more effective, right? It's a practical way of just mapping out occurrences. And then the last part of the Unit 1 is the types of outcomes. So after all of your assessments, if you decide to go forth with providing behavioral intervention and services, you need to decide with the caretakers what is the ultimate outcome that is going to help your client. So there's 3 types of outcomes. There's the ultimate, which is considered like your final goal of service. And think of this as like, let's say the client wants to get a job. That's their ultimate goal. So we're going to help them achieve that as best we can. The second type of outcome is an intermediate outcome. And that's kind of like accomplishable steps towards the ultimate goal. It'll bring them closer to it. It's not the final goal, but it's steps to get there. So in the example of getting a job, an intermediate step or goal for that would be to complete an interview, right? So just because you complete an interview doesn't mean you get a job, but completing an interview will help you get a job. So that's more of like where you do your task analysis, you break things down into steps. That way you can make them a bit more digestible. And then the last type of outcome is a short-term outcome. So these are numerical objectives with a criterion. So realistically, if the ultimate goal is getting a job, intermediate goal is to finish an interview, then the short-term goal would be you want to be able to answer 6 interview questions with high fluency and low stuttering or whatnot. So you can actually numerically count the progress of what you're doing. So it goes from short-term to intermediate to ultimate. It's questions within an interview, completing the interview, and getting a job, right? So there's different steps along the way. So those are the 3 types of outcomes. And I actually really liked how one of the teachers described it, or one of the co-instructors described it as, imagine climbing a mountain. Climbing the mountain is the ultimate goal. Your base camps are going to be your intermediate goals, and the steps per day is your short-term goals. So just think of it that way, and that's how you're going to map out the general intervention of your services. So hopefully that explains enough of Unit 1. Like I said, they do deep dive quite a bit into like the criticisms, behavioral assessment funnel. Like they really go into like types of scopes and fidelities and how it rubber bands along the middle. Like I said, I personally found the graphic to be a little confusing. I just found it a lot easier for me to just think about it. But they have a lot of different steps for the preliminary assessments and whatnot, and they go into each of those. So just know that just remember to study those when you go in, before you go into the Unit 1 final exam for that one, because they do ask a lot of questions about those. So if you have any questions about this unit, leave them in the comments down below. I try to respond at least within a few days, and I will see you guys in the next video.